Okay, hello and welcome everybody. I'm Rebekah Saltzman and I'm here tonight with Rabbi Johnny Solomon, and I will introduce him in just a moment. But before we get started tonight, I would just like to give a brief introduction about why we're meeting tonight. There we go. Okay, some feedback. Okay, so I'm Rebekah Saltzman from Balagan Vegan Personal Organization, and I am here tonight with Rav Johnny because I wanted to give a memorial on the honor of my mother's third yahrzeit to my mother, Esther Bat Yitzchak V'Sara, or as she was known in English, Ruth. And I chose the topic of Hachnasat Orchim because my mom was really an expert at Hachnasat Orchim. And I think that it's very apropos that this week's Parsha in the United States or in outside of Israel is Balotacha. And that was the Parsha that we had last week here in Israel. And the thing about the Parsha of Balotacha, in and of itself, it's not specifically addressing Jewish continuity, but the Haftorah is addressing Jewish continuity when it talks about how the Kohen Gadol would light the menorah, and the Kohen Gadol was chastised for certain things that he did and or didn't do. And the commentaries there say that he was chastised because it was a breach in Jewish continuity. And Jewish continuity was one of the most important things to my mother. And the way that she showed that was through her Hachnasat Orchim. She prioritized helping anybody in need and showing us that helping other people, me and my brother and my sister, and I think my cousins, who I think some of them are here tonight or watching, exactly how important it was. She was the inspiration for my book, Organized Jewish Life. She's the reason that I wrote it. She is the inspiration behind it. And she's my guiding light always. So yeah, she was excellent at Hachnasat Orchim, and so I thought for this very first time on this memorial lecture, which hopefully will become an annual tradition, it would be really great to review the halachot of Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming guests and being hospitable, because I think, even I, who maybe you'll think I'm so great at it, but I'm not as good as she was, but I feel like we're all a little bit rusty, having been in hibernation for the last few years, and we could use a refresher on just exactly what is expected of us as hosts and what is expected of us as guests. And we're not going to show up and be perfect every time, but it's good to know what the guidelines are. So I'm going to intro Rabbi Johnny Solomon in just 1 minute. What we're going to do tonight is we are going to give an overview of the halachot of Hachnasat Orchim. Then we will talk about tips and tricks for being a guest and tips and tricks for being a host. And then we will open it up for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to intro Rav Johnny. Rav Johnny Solomon is a Torah teacher, halacha guide, and spiritual coach. Born in the UK, now living in Israel, he teaches halacha and Jewish thought at Matan and Midrash at Lindenbaum. He delivers online shiurim and courses to organizations, offering online spiritual coaching, halachic consultations, and Torah study sessions to men, women, and couples around the world. Beyond this, Rav Johnny writes a popular daily insight on Daf Yomi. He is the contributor to RZ Weekly Podcast. He is an active board member of Chachmat Nashim, of which I have a seal of approval, and he volunteers at Sohar to perform weddings for secular Israelis. He is also a posek in his local shul in Even Shmuel. Welcome, Rav Johnny.
Well, thank you so much, Rebekah. What a warm welcome and what a special event. And I feel very, very privileged to play a small part in this broader conversation, which hopefully will then lead to action. It's always important to know, as a rabbi say, La midrash ikar ela ma'aseh. Talk is good, but actions are great. And hopefully what this conversation should do is inspire actions, especially in the realm of Hachnasat Orchim, which clearly your dear mother was such really, she gave a masterclass in this. Apparently, when people
Every
come
week.
to your home. And it's important to note, just before we look at some texts, as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, it's always good to have textbooks, but ultimately it's great to have text people who ultimately live and teach through their behavior. So we're going to share some ideas, but ultimately there's nothing better than observing somebody being a great host and hostess, and then saying, I want to be like that, and modeling yourself on them. So what we're going to do now is look through a few teachings about the laws of Hachnasat Orchim, showing hospitality, and Derech Eretz, in expressing oneself with etiquette and showing manners to others. And I'm going to share my screen right now. Hopefully you should be able to see it in just a moment. I just going to
Johnny, is it possible for you to sit a little bit closer to your mic? It's a little bit hard to hear you, everybody says. Just so you know, the closed captionings are on, so that is also
okay. Hopefully
available.
you should be able to
much
hear
better.
me. Okay, so I'm right here now. Beautiful, fantastic, and thank you for saying so, because it's always good to make sure that everyone can hear. So I believe that you should all be able to see my presentation right now. You have a beautiful picture of the kind of home where guests come along, young and old, trying to figure themselves out around a meal, or perhaps afterwards, and playing a game and schmoozing and having a great time together. But the question we're going to explore, the questions we're going to address are there any Jewish laws and any Jewish ethics relating to Hachnasat Orchim, hospitality, and Derech Eretz, etiquette and manners? And the short answer is yes. And we're going to touch on some, but certainly not all. And just before we look at our first text, and I've prepared a number of texts in Hebrew and English, I want to inform you there is actually a tractate in the Talmud titled Derech Eretz, listing the laws of etiquette and manners, especially as they apply to hospitality. That may well surprise people, but actually the rabbis took hospitality so seriously that they codified ideas, some of which we're going to study, some of which we may agree with, some perhaps we will question about how we can apply them today. So here is our first teaching. We're going to go through 6 teachings. The first 3 are going to be pro-guest tips, and the next 3 are going to be pro-host tips. How to be a pro-guest, right? And then how to be a pro-host. So in terms of being a pro-guest tip, we are taught in this tractate called Derech Eretz. And I'll read it both in Hebrew and in English. Hanichnas labayit, when you go into somebody else's home, kol ma shigazer alav ba'al habayit yaseh. Whatever the host or hostess asks you to do, presuming it's something permitted, then you should do. Something permitted meaning they're not asking you to necessarily eat something not kosher or do something entirely inappropriate. There's a rule of thumb according to laws of Derech Eretz. Whatever a host or hostess asks you to do, you should do. You may well say, surely that's common sense. The question that I'd like to raise, and I'm very, very happy for some kind of to and fro now, a brief conversation, is how far does that go? When it says whatever they ask you to do, do. I mean, if they say, can you help with the dishes? I think that's common courtesy to say yes.
100%.
If they ask you to move some furniture, I presume if you can, that'll be wonderful. But as I wrote down, if your host wants you to play a game of chess and you'd rather read a book, is it rude to refuse them? What are the boundaries? So what do you think, Rebekah?
Okay, so I think that there's limitations on both sides. I mean, if your host asks you to do something that you don't feel entirely comfortable doing, you can refuse them. But I also think that, when possible, you should definitely take the opportunity to do what they're asking you.
Right. So what that means is to be a host or hostess means to have a sense of reasonableness towards your guest. And to be a guest, it means to have a sense of flexibility towards your host or hostess, right? So You need to be reasonable, not ask something crazy, but at the same time, you've got to kind of play with them because you're in their home.
100%. I feel like both parties have to sort of read the room.
Right.
So
that's an interesting thing. Yeah. How do you read the room? How do you sense where people are at?
Right. So sometimes I feel like I'm in a situation where you could tell maybe they're a little bit bored. So you want to play cards or do a puzzle, or do you just want to read a book? But I feel like you have to kind of get a sense of exactly who the person is and kind of know where they're at. But I also feel as like a guest, when you walk in, you can give your host some clues. Like if you aren't feeling great and you want to walk in and not that you're grumpy necessarily, but you want to spend Shabbat sleeping. If you're an overnight guest, let's say, oh, I had such a rough week, and I think I'm just going to try to sleep it off as much as possible. Then I feel like both of you have sort of set a standard without being rude to each other.
100%. I'll give you actually an interesting example of this. As it happens, I don't drink alcohol. And if I go to somebody's house and they say, would you like a whiskey? And I say, no, thanks. Am I being rude? I don't think I am. But oftentimes we presume that there are certain things that people do with their guests.
Exactly. I don't think you're being rude. I feel like it's a personal preference on food, and everybody has them. And I think it would be wrong for a host to pressure you. I mean, sometimes people decline because they're being polite. So I feel like a second ask, are you sure, is okay? Because sometimes people don't know if you're offering because you're trying to be polite, or if you're declining because you're trying to be polite. So I feel like, you could ask, but if after the second time, I feel like you don't have to press.
Right. I think that's an important rule of thumb. Ask once, I suppose explicitly, ask a second time as just as a follow-up, and then respond by whatever you felt was their right answer, be it yes or no. We're going to see in a second, when the rabbis detailed the laws of hospitality and derech eretz, they acknowledged how guests often feel a little bit more reluctant. And so they're kind of putting the onus on the host or the hostess. But nevertheless, there does need to be a sense of understanding that people come in sometimes hungry, sometimes tired, sometimes with lots of things on their mind. And when you're welcoming people into your home, if you really want to be a good host, then you need to take them as they're at. Right? You need to realize that, people bring in, we're going to see in a second, from the story of Abraham, he offered water for his guests when they came to his tent. And just as guests may bring in dirt, sometimes they bring in pressure on their shoulders, worries from the week. And you don't need to be their therapist, but you certainly need to be understanding as a host.
100%.
Okay, so let's move on to rule number 2, also from this same tractate, although we'll be looking at other sources too. And this one actually relates to you being a guest. When you go into somebody else's house, don't basically say, can you give me some food so I can eat? You should wait until you're invited to eat. Now, we're going to see in a second, when you're a host, you should offer your guests food relatively quickly because they could be tired, they could be hungry. But as a guest, you should basically show some manners and kind of wait until you're offered. Now here,
so how long is appropriate time to wait till you're offered?
So the thing is, the nudge is given, and we'll see in a moment, to the hosts. You should be offering immediately.
Right.
Sometimes they may not be doing so, and then one should wait patient. I agree, though, there may well become a point of awkwardness. But if that awkwardness arises, who has ultimately failed? It's actually the host, because their task was to show hospitality. Now, if for whatever reason that happens, obviously a person may well say, is there anything I can do to help? Which is really code for I'm hungry. But knowing how to do that in an appropriate way, obviously, is important. And there may well be instances when you don't quite know how to do that because there's a significant power differential between you and your host that you feel even that would be overstepping a boundary.
So I actually have a tip here.
Yeah,
if I may, for a moment.
Sure.
One of the things that I think is really important as a guest is to notify your host when you're arriving. Especially if you're, not so much if you're just coming for like a meal, like on Shabbat, let's say, but if you're like an overnight guest, if you're notifying them when you're arriving, even if you're a little early or a little bit late, they can plan to have something available to you. But if you just show up sort of without any warning, and they don't really know when you're coming. They're guessing. So they might not be totally prepared.
Mm.
So if you're expecting that you might be hungry when you arrive, I feel like it's, first of all, it's just courteous to be like, I'm going to come at, 2:00. And if that's not okay, let me know and I'll arrive a little bit later. But I feel like that's a code for, could you have something ready at 2:00?
Well, you can see the question to consider is, can you as a guest decide what time you're going to arrive for a meal? Because if you're supposed to wait for your host to serve you, then surely basically the meal is determined by the host. So should I say, I'm going to come at 1, maybe that family eats at 12, right? So there is often this question of figuring out a time to come where everyone's showing such grace to one another, but actually everyone ends up disappointed. The person who comes arrives earlier than they'd like, and the person whose home it is starts later than their plan.
Right.
So
I'm talking about like a
needed.
Friday afternoon for Shabbos if you're going to be a whole weekend guest. But if you're coming for a meal, it's incumbent on the host to say, we eat lunch at 11:30. By the way, we eat lunch at 11:30. If you ever come to our house, it's always at 11:30.
And is it inappropriate to say? I don't think it is, by the way. I think it's actually very, very helpful. This is saying, this is how we do things in our place.
Yeah, well, we're inviting you. We eat at 11:30. If that doesn't work for you, then you're free to decline. You don't have to come. But I feel like if I'm upfront with you about this is what's happening, then that's what's happening.
Right. And I actually think that's actually expressive of the law and the ethics of the law, which is it's the host who establishes basically when the meal is served. And therefore, the host or hostess should be explicit in stating, in terms of a meal, this is when we eat. They can, of course, show a certain sense of flexibility, but it shouldn't be to such a point where the guest is ultimately determining the schedule of the home. That really turns
100%.
the whole project on its right.
But in the larger sense, though, I feel like if a guest is coming for a weekend or they're an overnight guest or sometime even during the week, a lot of when they arrive is going to depend on things that are external factors. And so as long as they're upfront with you, even as a host, that you're not available, like to make contingency plans, I feel like is suitable. I mean, because you can't be expected to just be at everybody's beck and call.
Right, 100%.
Is that what the halacha says? I mean, I'm assuming that is no.
On the contrary. However, there's sometimes, I had this. I was a guest in somebody's house just last weekend. They were amazing, but they didn't explicitly say, help yourself to tea and coffee. I know they wanted to, and I know they meant it, so I did. But sometimes we think we've said things because we're being so generous. But there are certain guests who need to be told, otherwise they'll hold back. And for me, without a coffee on, any day of the week, I'm not such a nice person. So knowing that that's an available resource, the good thing to know. If it's not available, it's a good thing to know as well. But when it comes to hospitality, being explicit is important because things unsaid lead to confusion and sometimes disappointment. Now,
I agree.
It just mentioned in the second part of this statement, and there's a whole series of discussions that follow. If your host pours out a goblet of wine for you, you should drink it with pauses, meaning don't drink it in one go. I think this is reflective of certain customs where nowadays I'm not quite sure whether a host would take offense if I knock back a drink, but I suspect in certain places they may. That means not just how you talk and how one behaves, but even how one eats to a certain measure. Now, we're not talking about hosts who are deliberately controlling, but like you said before, you got to read people. There are certain people who clearly do things differently to perhaps the way you would have done or I would have done at home. And so eating with fingers is generally not a good thing, even if you do that on your own. And slurping things generally is not encouraged. This is discussed even in the Talmud. But even how you drink a drink is considered to be a question of derech eretz, of etiquette and manners. So I don't know if you think those apply nowadays or those are just kind of old school things that really don't have much relevance today.
Well, no, I definitely think table manners are important. I think, well, first of all, I think like post-corona, we live in sort of a germaphobe kind of world. So I feel like especially on Shabbat, when most meals are served family style, the rules of etiquette regarding silverware and fingers are especially important, especially if you're not feeling well.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing to show up at somebody's house if you don't feel well and you say to them, like, I haven't been feeling well, but if they're okay with that, then fine. But like, if you're not feeling well, you have to be extra cautious about how you handle silverware, making sure your hands are clean, because today we know that's how germs are spread. So I feel like that's an important thing to note. But like, don't stick your fingers in things in communal dishes. Don't use your fingers to take things off. If you're stuck, like, take a little bit more and then try to, like, get it off, or ask for an additional piece of silverware to help you. But I think that, like, there is a general misunderstanding of how to actually manage in a family style setting, which a lot of people don't know for some reason why. I don't know why.
Well, I'll just add onto that. My wife, unfortunately, had to go through cancer treatment and chemotherapy last year. Thank God she's doing much better.
Amazing.
But when you have a compromised immune system, small coughs and colds really are incredibly dangerous. Now, we presume that we know what's going on in the home of our host, but we don't always. So you said if somebody's coming to your house, they should say they're not feeling well. In most instances, that's okay, and people will go with the flow. In some cases, that's a problem, because you may not know that there's somebody in the house who is, in a difficult situation where even a minor cold could put them at risk. So checking ahead of time, you don't need to say, is anybody in your house, feeling unwell or has any kind of illness that leads them to have a reduced immune system. But one should certainly say ahead of time, this is me, and give your host the opportunity to gently refuse and say, we already wanted you to come, but that's not a possibility this week or this month. We had to do that a couple of times last year. We did it with grace. We did it because
you had to.
And
I feel like it's incumbent upon the guest to not just be like, oh, I have to show up. The only exception that I found is that, like, if it's already Shabbos and you're not feeling well and you have no other way, like, I would try to send a messenger, or at least show up and be like, I'm not going to stay, but I just wanted you to know I'm not okay. And, like, you should start without me or something like that.
Yeah.
But, like, to just not show up is, I feel like, worrisome. But I also think that if you specifically told somebody, this is just a side point, but if you specifically told somebody, we eat lunch at 11:30, then if they're not there by 11:45, I feel like that's license to start. Like, totally. It's totally fair to be like, okay, they're not coming anymore. And I feel like as a host, you could totally mention that, like, if we don't see you by 11:45, we'll start without you.
Yeah.
But then everybody knows the rules. I always like to say, I say this to my kids, I think they're sick of hearing it, but clarity is kindness, right? Like, if you're clear, everybody knows what the expectations are.
Well, let's talk about this third rule, the pro tip for a guest, and then we're going to go to host tips. And some people may like this, and some people may find this really difficult. Because in that same tractate called Derech Eretz, it tells us the following: Lo yomar adam lachavero, bo ve'echol ma she'echaltani. Don't go and say to your friend, come and eat at my house just as I came to your house. Because this is some kind of ribit, which is translated as interest or usury, meaning I'm having to pay you back what you did. Now, we often feel that I came to your house, I owe you an invitation. Even that phrase, owe you, is a very, very weird turn of phrase. The rabbis say it's not just a problem of owing. Actually, if you think about it monetarily, if you pay them back more than you owe, you're actually paying back interest, which is one of the Torah prohibitions. Now, admittedly, the next line of this teaching says, in Jerusalem they did, but I think what they're saying is Jerusalem was a very unique city, and there was an understanding, especially there was also a poor city. But they're wary of how people often are petty about invitations, that you shouldn't say, I came and therefore I owe you, because that devalues the gift of welcoming another. It makes it feel like I now have to reciprocate, and reciprocation is important, but not simply because you invited me. It should be because I like you.
I agree. I feel like people like hold a cheshbon, like an accounting, and I feel like it's not necessary. If someone invites you, it's because they want to spend time with you. And I get that sometimes it feels unbalanced, like they're always doing something for me. I am a frequent guest in their house and they're always doing something for me, so I should do something for them. But I don't think that the relationships need to be transactional, like quid pro quo. Like they don't need to be like equal. Like you can be friends with somebody without doing the same thing that they do for you.
I actually think it cheapens. And the weird thing is, if I really take hospitality seriously, I really don't want you to see what I'm doing as being transactional, because it isn't. I invite you because I like you. And
Right.
if I happen to be invited to your house, great. But I'm not doing it because you did. It's because we're really kind of like paying it forward, but we're not switching each other, because you did this for me, I scratch your back.
Right.
And too often that word "owe" is used within communities. And as you say, people keep tallies. We owe this person. I didn't owe this person. I went, I didn't go back, or et cetera, et cetera. And I think it makes hospitality something which is just firstly about people who've done you a favor already, and also overlooks the core ethic of hospitality, which is stressed here in Derech Eretz and elsewhere. It's really primarily for people who need. Meaning it's nice to host your friends. It's nice to host people who already have food in their cupboard. Go and do that. That's still hospitality. But ideally, one should show hospitality to somebody who can't pay you back, somebody who's really in need. And too often we think Hachnasat Orchim is just to the people who we like. Hachnasat Orchim is primarily to the people who sometimes drive us crazy. But we show them kindness. In so doing, we try and imitate and emulate God.
So we actually have a question, which I think is really good and relevant to this part of the pro tips. What about the single scene where there is generally an expectation that different people host Shabbat meals at different times?
So
I think that's a great question.
Firstly, I think it's a brilliant question, and hospitality applies to everybody. And at the same time, it's expressed uniquely in every individual setting. I think that every community does have a certain understanding. In certain localities, those communities have a certain understanding, and certain demographics create communities, and those communities have a certain understanding. Because hospitality isn't just about the food, it's about looking out for one another, it's about caring for one another. And especially when we're dealing with groups of singles living in a certain neighborhood or a little bit beyond that, especially in the more observant Jewish communities, Shabbat is when you get to check in with one another. It's when you get to make time to hear how each of you are doing. So I think it's a beautiful idea of having some kind of cycle, but it's not necessarily because of an owing. It's because of a wish to give. It's actually coming from the purest of intentions. Just because there is, and we'll speak in a moment, I mean, this is what you do, right? Just because a person organizes how they do hospitality doesn't negate the ethic of showing hospitality. So to be organized in how you open up your home or you visit different people's homes doesn't diminish the kindness is shown in every individual setting. But that language of "oh," I think, is not particularly helpful. Perhaps we can switch it to another word, that it's, we're doing a cycle where we each invite
Take responsibility.
each other. Right.
Yeah. It's about being
beautiful.
responsible in the community, which I feel like is a totally different way to address the issue rather than feeling like you are owing something to somebody, which is never a good feeling.
Right. And even the language, often say, who do we need to invite? And that word "oh" is often used, but the word "need" is, do you need an invitation? There are people who do need an invitation. They're poor. They don't have food. There are other people who need an invitation emotionally. They have food in the cupboard. They need that friendship. There are other people who actually have food and they're doing okay, but they would welcome an invitation. How we use language is, sorry,
Bless you.
thank you, is very, very important, because even how we invite somebody can implicitly insult them. I didn't. Do you need an invitation to come to my house this Shabbat? I know you haven't been in our house for a while. Even that can make a person feel small, even when you're intending to make them feel, tall. So language, it matters, and tone matters, and sensitivity matters.
Okay, so Mark's bringing up another great point, which is at a certain point, though, some singles exploit others. And so some people end up just hosting and never get the invites that they need for their psychological health. So I guess that leads to a really great question, in my opinion. Can you invite yourself?
A person can seek an invitation, and that's totally justified. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get a yes from the person to whom they seek that invitation. But
I mean, I personally have no
reasonable.
problem. I really like it when people say, "Hey, I would love to have some company this Shabbat. Can I come?" And if I can't do it, I say so. But I never feel obligated to say yes to someone. But I feel like I really like it when people ask.
I think it's incredibly important, and at the same time, I know many people, especially many singles, feel a reluctance to do so. Especially when they live in a neighborhood when they only know a select group of people. They actually don't know other people around there. Mm-hmm. And there's a particular young woman who I'm thinking of where she called me for different reasons. Certain difficult things arose in her life. I didn't know personally, but we had a conversation, and I realized that she was living in a neighborhood when she didn't know many people. I said, how is your weekends? Are you eating at people's houses? And she said, not so much. I said, would you mind if I try and help arrange some invitations? And she said, I'd appreciate it. People sometimes are reluctant to even ask, but they'd appreciate somebody else making the arrangement. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give to somebody, especially if you don't live nearby, is to figure out who does and open those metaphorical doors for them. By making those connections. So what did I do in that particular case? I called a friend who does live nearby. I said, listen, I know this wonderful person who would appreciate some Shabbat invitations, but she's not going to ask. I know you know great people, and I trust you implicitly. Can you help me? And she gave me a couple of lists of numbers. I called these people, and I basically then passed on their numbers to her, and I said, all you need to do is just send them a message. They're waiting for you as and when you wish. Meaning there's no more hurdles to deal with, right, other than saying this Friday or next Friday. That arrangement, obviously, a person sometimes needs to make themselves. But that's how we can help people in different communities. Many people have networks, and simply to help individuals, singles, and sometimes married and living in neighborhoods they're not familiar with, but helping them navigate what's going on around them by using that network to their benefit is a true gift. It's a bigger gift than sometimes even a single meal, because what you're doing is helping sure that they have many, especially if you're not so nearby. So that's something I've tried to do a little bit, and it's particularly expressed among singles. And if there's anybody on this call who you think, I may know people in your neighborhood, and I can, help put in, not necessarily a good word, it's nothing to do with that, but help be a shadchan, right? A matchmaker of meals, then that would be wonderful.
And we put Johnny's contact information in the chat, so everybody has access to it.
Great, with pleasure. I'm a lousy matchmaker in general, but matchmaking meals, that I can do. And I think most of us can do as well. And if we would just do that a little bit, I think it would help people look beyond worlds than those they necessarily immediately know.
I want to just ask a question, draw like a thing that I see a lot. Oh, I see your question, Maureen. Hold on, I'll ask it in a second. But for me, I see a lot of complaining in chats about single people saying, like, it doesn't feel good to have to invite myself, or I sit alone. This is a particular problem for people who are divorced or widowed. But what I often find is that families feel stretched, to have guests all the time. So actually what I think you're proposing is really great. Like, I can't host, but I know that this person might have a need. So I'll reach out to them, see if they have a need. And I can't fulfill that need this week, but I can help you fulfill that need. So I feel like that's a really great alternative to, I can't host you myself this week. But I feel like there's this level of expectation on both sides that kind of needs to be addressed.
I agree. I think it's a probably too large a topic for us to try and dive into. And there's lots of permutations of people. I have some dear friends who are married but don't have children, although they've tried in many different ways to do so. And they live in a neighborhood with lots of families with lots of kids. And so even for them, getting invitations is a beautiful thing, but sometimes it can create serious issues and awkward moments. Obviously, knowing who is coming to your house is important. Knowing to whose house you're going to is important. And in the
So is it incumbent upon the host to disclose the guest list?
Now that's an interesting question. You may want to say, do you want to know who else is coming? I did actually have a situation just a couple of months ago where my cousin was going through a really difficult divorce, and I invited him for a Friday night meal. He agreed, but then my wife had invited another family. I didn't know about it because whatever, things just got busy kind of quite on that Friday morning. And so I called my cousin. I said, he was like in a really miserable state. And I said, I know you're coming to my house. I can't wait. But I just want you to know there's going to be somebody else that was really bubbly, right? And he could have easily said, forget about it. I'm done. That's a Friday night I don't want right now. But he came and it was fantastic. I do think knowing roughly where people are at and giving them that choice is important, because dynamics are created sometimes intentionally, sometimes organically. But knowing who else is going to be around the table changes one's expectation. If you think it's just going to be you and your friend that you sit near in shul, and actually you're sitting 20 chairs away, that's going to be quite frustrating. Right. So okay. Yeah, having a sense of what you're walking into is incredible.
Clarity is kind. We actually got a really good question regarding to guests before we head over to hosts. Question: when you have overnight guests for Shabbat, is it expected that they come ready for Shabbat, like showering and stuff like that? I think it depends on the scenario, but what do you say? Like if they've been traveling for like a long distance and they're just arriving on the airplane and they're coming in and it's right before Shabbos, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect that they don't want to take a shower. But if they're just coming from like the next neighborhood over, then they probably won't want to.
I think it depends on those factors. Absolutely depends on literally the physiology of different people. I shower, at least once, twice, sometimes 3 times a day. I'm just a sweaty guy, whatever. So even if I haven't traveled far, I like to go into Shabbat feeling showered, feeling clean and ready to enter Shabbat. And so if I go somewhere and I've had to travel more than maybe a half an hour, especially with luggage, I'd probably appreciate being able to at least freshen up in some measure. Other people don't need that. My wife generally will always shower at home and will go somewhere else. So it depends on every single person. If a person has needs, though, then communicating that is important. So I was traveling recently. I was coming from one city to another. I did know that I'd want to shower for Shabbat. It's not something I generally would insist on, but just worked out that situation. So I said to my host, please God, I'll be coming at this time. I hope it's okay, but I'll probably need to shower or at least freshen up. And they said, fine. And they made sure that you also don't know how many bathrooms they're going to have, right? So they made sure I wasn't trying to say I need to shower at this time, but they, knowing that, were able to be a little bit more sensitive to me, and I could be a little bit more sensitive to them. Other than that, when sometimes everyone comes along half an hour before Shabbat, everyone needs to shower, that's unhelpful, and it often ends up that the third or fourth person has a cold shower, which isn't nice either. So planning these things is all about the practicality of being a host and the practicality of being a guest. But it's really on you as the guest to reveal what you know. It's on you as a host to ask questions which you think may well be pertinent to help you be a better host.
Okay, so both sides have responsibility, but
Yeah,
who's responsible? Like, I feel like the host should be forthcoming in trying to get these questions out from the guest.
They should. I agree. Just as much as it's often, we could talk about this for a while. I have kids with allergies, so really it's on the guest to say I'm allergic to all the food you're about to cook, or it's on the host. But the general common practice, the host asks, is there any food dislikes or allergies? And the guest should respond. If the host doesn't ask, especially if you're arriving or made this arrangement nearer to, let's say, Shabbat, and we're focusing Shabbat because this is where a lot of hospitality occurs, then the guest should be saying, I know, I just want to let you know, X, Y, Z. It may all be annoying, but they'd rather hear it on Thursday than be told it as you're about to, be served
like candles,
the chicken
yeah.
soup. Right.
One thing that I'll just say is in the book, Organized Jewish Life, there is a checklist for you to ask your guests before they come. And there is a checklist for guests to ask their host. So you should definitely investigate and check out that copy. I'll just give a little plug.
And I just want to say on that point, we are perhaps all nodding our heads saying this is all obvious. Come on, this is common sense, which arguably much of this is. However, we need to educate towards common sense. So I teach in seminaries, and sometimes 18, 19-year-old women, and sometimes we have male guests coming, they're less good at this. It's not because they're less good people. They're great kids.
No, it's that they don't think about it because they think it's easy. I'm just one person. Or they forget that this is an issue because their mom always took care of it for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to educate towards being a good guest. And obviously, in time, educate towards being a good host. And they're not so simple. Let's go on to the laws about.
Let's talk about hosts.
The pro-host. There are, again, 3 different teachings. And of course, there are many more to go. So this comes from Maimonides, actually towards the end of the laws of mourning, although this isn't a law to do with mourning. It's actually just a law to do with looking out for one another. I'll read it just in English. He says, the reward one receives for accompanying guests. Now, accompanying means when they're leaving, is greater than all the others. This is a statute which Abraham, our patriarch, instituted, and the path of kindness which he would follow with his wife Sarah. He would feed wayfarers, provide them with drink, and accompany them. Showing hospitality for guests surpasses receiving the divine presence. This is a teaching of the rabbis based on Genesis, Bereshit, chapter 18, verse 3. Accompanying them is greater than showing them hospitality. Now, somehow the rabbis were very, very emphatic. When your guest comes, it's wonderful. You welcome them and you bring them in, etc. You also need to walk them a little bit when they leave. Generally, we do it till the door. Some people do it a little bit more than that. One of the reasons they say is to make sure that that guest travels safely and is led on to the next part of their journey. Others simply say it's just good manners. But the key thing that the rabbis seem to be emphasizing here is hospitality isn't just the food you give. It's the way you greet people, the way you accompany people. It's the sense that when somebody leaves your house, they know that they care. They know, that you care how they're doing, and they know that you're thinking about them even once you've left.
Well, I think nobody wants to be said like, you can show yourself out, like, right, goodbye, so long, farewell,
People
like
do that, and actually it's in conflict with the Jewish ethic. Of course, a person generally can show themselves out, but we're saying don't let them do that, because there's something lovely about feeling accompanied. Even lovelier when you shake their hand or give them a hug and send them with blessings. We often say, blessed are you when you arrive and blessed are you when you leave. If a person feels blessed when they arrive but feels a little bit lousy when they leave, that's not a good feeling. So let them leave with blessings, with a sense that they're going not just with a fuller stomach, but also a sense that others are looking out for them. That's super important in all cases, and especially, as we mentioned before, when hospitality relates to those more vulnerable, more alone, they should know that others are looking out for them. That's why we bring people in our home, in order to communicate that we see them as being part of our family.
I love that. That's really great. I have nothing to add.
Okay, so let's move on to the next two teachings, and these come from a chapter in Yisrael Meir Kagan's book Ahavat Chesed. He's known as a Chaifetz and he wrote a book of doing kindness, and in there's a whole chapter titled "Being a Good Host." It's fascinating, and he begins by interpreting that story of Abraham and Sarah. And I want to explore one of the remarks he makes, where he says, the verse about Abraham and Sarah's hospitality inform us how Abraham sought water for his guests so they could wash their feet from the dirt of their journey. And we should do similar things. Right? I mentioned this beforehand. Meaning when people arrive at one's house, you should make sure that they are physically looked after. If they come with a soaking wet jacket, take it and hang it up. If they come with dirty shoes, say, is there a place and I can put those for you? But like ultimately it also applies to emotions. If they come with things on their shoulders, on their mind, try and see what you can to help them kind of shed that load and feel comfortable in your home.
But I think also like anticipating people's needs is like something that a lot of hosts don't necessarily do. Like if the weather is bad, if we're expecting someone to take off their shoes, like we can make sure we have extra socks on hand, or at least have a towel where they can wipe their feet if you don't want them to bring their shoes into the house, or if their shoes are wet and they need to take them off, like give them something to dry off with. It's not the same as like washing, feet kind of situation like it was then, but it's a similar situation where we need to anticipate like what is happening in the greater universe and how we can receive our guests in a way that is constructive. You said Avas Chesed is the Chaifetz, right?
It's a book of the Chaifetz, yes.
Yeah, okay. No, there was a question. So we're just, Esther, I hope that answers it for you.
Now, I'll give you just two things. One, you mentioned about shoes, and one completely different. Just recently, I went to somebody's house. I was staying at their house, and I didn't know ahead of time that they prefer that guests don't walk upstairs with shoes. They're very plush carpet on their stairs, and so they generally expect guests to take off their shoes. Now, they hadn't mentioned this to me ahead of time. It wasn't a problem. I don't care. I'm not a Cohen, but still, I walk around with nice socks. However, there may well be people who don't. And so a simple thing that you take off your shoes and walk around in your socks, which is what a family may well do, perhaps for others is a very awkward thing. At least making people aware of that or giving the option not to is, I'd say, very, very valuable. To presume somehow that people are comfortable to take off their shoes is a big presumption for some people. It's a nothing for others.
Right.
You need to meet people. You need to know who they're at. And you don't necessarily know how comfortable a person would be about taking off their shoes. And they'll have smelly feet, who knows, whatever else. That's one thing. A second thing, a very modern thing, is whenever guests come to my house, within the first 5 minutes, I offer them our Wi-Fi password. I think in the modern world, especially when I have people who are traveling, staying at my house, knowing that they can connect with their families, make a call home and say, I arrived, is an important thing. And so there's a variety of practical things, such as, do you want my Wi-Fi password? They may well say, thanks, I don't need it. They may well say, oh, I really appreciate it, thanks. Most times the answer is in the affirmative. And having that short list of reminders, either for you as a host or preparing it as a piece of paper so that when they walk into that room, it's there for them.
I already did it for you. It's in the book. Everything's there. All I need to do is get the book.
There you go. We mentioned this before, which is a wonderful thing. So that's a kind of a modern version thing. And of course, it could be that people, if somebody says I have allergies and they don't drink milk, for example, it's a lovely thing to do to offer a milk alternative. I don't think you're required, I certainly think it's a lovely thing to do if somebody's used to having almond milk rather than necessarily cow's milk for coffee or tea or whatever.
Elle says it's worth collecting slippers from hotels, the cheap white ones they expect you to take, and then you have new slippers to guests if you want them to take shoes off. Yeah, I know a lot of people do this.
Yes.
Okay, so on the one hand, I'll just say for myself as a personal organizer, where I see that people have like a lot of excess in their homes, I don't love this solution. On the other hand, if you do entertain and this is a rule in your house, then this is something that you should make space for. So it's all about prioritizing the things that you have in your house. And I think that one of the things that is very important to note is that you don't have to necessarily keep things on hand just in case, but if there are things that you do use, you can keep them. And it like for guests specifically, like my parents didn't drink coffee, but my mom always had coffee in the house because some of her guests like to drink coffee. So that's the kind of thing that in a small quantity, I feel like is okay. But I think we also have to be very reasonable about how much quantity we really need. Like, do you need a 10-pound bag of coffee if you don't drink coffee yourself for the occasional guest who drinks coffee? No, like a small container of instant coffee is sufficient, you know? So I just want to say, you know, everything in perspective. We have a question actually. How do you politely let guests know that it's time to leave?
So I think it's often even useful ahead of time to say, would you like to come to our house for one? We generally, you know, spend an hour and a half or 2 hours eating, and then I have a sleep. As if to say it code for that's when the time comes for you to leave. Being clear about pace is important because we presume that people read our minds, and often they can't. And we also presume that people want to go home, and often they don't. As I said, being a host actually is showing that you care. And if somebody, it could be somebody without family, could be a single, could be a divorcee, could be somebody just passing by. They've invited to your home and you've had your meal and you want to then have a rest, it's your prerogative. But it's up to you. Obviously, if you're not comfortable for them to say, then you should say, it's been so nice seeing you and thank you so much. But perhaps they'd like to hang around.
I always felt like benching was, you know, the code for it's time to leave.
I don't know. I don't know necessarily if it is, especially when some people often they do, after saying grace after meals, they may well offer hot drinks as if to indicate a continuation. Other people, just because a meal is ended, doesn't necessarily mean the hospitality is ended.
Right.
So transparency is helpful. Code words work for some people, not all people. And understanding what your guest wants and needs is also crucial. So saying, if you'd like to stay here, you're more than welcome. But I'm going to have a lie down, or you want to stay here and we can, you know, play some cards or, you know, have a schmooze. However, the flip side is also important. When I go to somebody's house, I also want to go back home. So feeling bound to stay is something nobody necessarily wants to experience.
Right.
That's why understandings are important. You know, feeling that you have to be there till 4 or 5 in the afternoon is sometimes a tricky thing.
Right.
And so, yeah.
So my husband and I instituted this. It's not a rule, but when we were first married, that we would try to keep Friday night dinner and also for Shabbos lunch, but Friday night dinner, like under 2 hours. And we would say, like, you know, you're welcome to stay. I mean, we're cleaning up. You want to help us clean up? That's great. We'll take your help, and you're welcome to stay and hang out. But you know, we didn't want anybody to ever feel obligated to stay. And we felt like 2 hours on a Shabbos meal is like a fair amount of time, considering, you know, it's Kiddush and Challah, and then especially on a Friday night, you probably have soup and maybe an appetizer and then the main course and then dessert and then benching. Like, it takes time to move everything in and out. So there has to be like a reasonable amount of time to do it, but it doesn't have to be, I don't think it needs to be like 4 hours unless it's like, there's something else going on. But I found that was really made it really clear to everybody, like, you can do whatever you need, but you don't have to stay. Like, we're happy to have you, but you don't have to stay. That really worked for us. My husband feels bad giving out the benchers because he thinks it makes them leave. I totally disagree. I think it's okay to like signal to that this is the end of the meal, and you can say to people, you don't have to go home, but we're going to bench. Also, there are halachic obligations and times that you need to say the grace after meals. So it's not like a totally unreasonable thing to just take out the benchers and be like, it's time to bench. I don't think it's unreasonable.
I agree. And I want to just add one further thing. We got with them one more rule, and then I'm going to kind of wrap up this kind of mini share of sorts, which is, we talked about reading the room, but we also need to avoid awkwardness. And awkwardness can come in also many different shapes and sizes. So I mentioned previously that I teach in seminaries. And that means sometimes we host seminary students in pairs or larger groups. But because I'm a male teacher, sometimes a bad practice, which has happened historically, which is a definite no-no, and thank God good practice is now being shared amongst different schools, is if, for example, after a meal, my wife is tired and is going to go to sleep, I'm going to do that even if I'm not, because I'm not going to be left kind of late at night schmoozing with a teenage young woman, who isn't my daughter. So if that would ever happen, then I say good night and I go and read a book upstairs, whatever it would be. Avoiding awkward or inappropriate moments, which may well seem fine because in your own home and one's behaving oneself, but still late at night creates different atmospheres. And so reading how things could be seen and how things could be interpreted means that both in terms of Jewish law and also good Jewish practice, one shouldn't be left in such a situation. And so obviously depending on the type of guest one has and perhaps the presence of other people in the room, etc. That's just something worthwhile mentioning in addition to the many things we've discussed so far.
It's a good practice, I think. I agree with you.
Right, let's end
let's do the last
one. One more teaching from, again, the Chaifetz Chaim. And he says something which, again, we may well find is tough to do. When guests come to your house, you should greet them with a positive demeanor. You should place food in front of them. He says, you as a host should be giving them food basically soon after they arrive, because it is possible that they are poor and hungry, reluctant to ask for anything. The presumption when we talk about hospitality is that somebody could be hungry. They may well genuinely be in need of food rather than just how we often use the term need. When serving guests, one should be gracious, not irritable. And even if you're worried by something, bothered by something, agitated by something, you should hide it from your guests. So, somebody could be driving you crazy, but a guest shouldn't feel that. A guest should feel that they're being looked after. And though I don't think you should necessarily act entirely when you have guests, I also don't necessarily think that everything that's going on in your world needs to be shared in front of them, because that too can create moments of discomfort. There could well be tension, a disagreement in a home, and that can now be felt by the guest. You want them to be shedding their load, not receiving more. So figuring out how you can be a good host or hostess when you have many things on your mind is an important thing. And if that's not possible, it's a perfectly reasonable, obviously with good time, to say, I know we said we would be able to host you, but something's come up and it's really going to be difficult, but if we found you somewhere else. That may not be a lovely thing to do, but it perhaps would be better than necessarily somebody being in your home while an individual is grumbling about having just lost their job and just can't say something positive, which would be palpable to the guests.
I feel like this was one area that my mom was really excellent at. She just could like be amazing until like whatever she needed to do, like to make you feel welcome. That's what she did. And she was great at that. And I am not half as good as her at that. But she was it's something to strive for, I think. I think though that like even if you feel like you're okay, it's hard to sometimes get to that place where if a lot of things build on it. Well, I mean, this goes back to what we talked about earlier about like reading the room and everything like that. But like sometimes it's hard to hold it all in. But I feel like if you do, just say you're sorry, because I don't feel like anybody thinks that, you know, I had to do that. I'll be upfront about it. I had to do it last week. And like, I don't feel bad. Nobody's perfect. Nobody can hold it together all the time. I feel like when you're able to hold it together, great. But if you can't, I feel like, you know, we're all doing the best we can.
Right. I'm just going to close the screen, but just say one further thing, and then perhaps we'll conclude this section, which is we often presume we know what's going on in the lives of others, and especially a home which seems to be capable financially, physically to host others. And if you're expecting an invitation from them and that doesn't happen, a person can even build up resentment for not receiving that expected invitation. Now, we mentioned before the idea of owing is actually not a healthy turn of phrase and probably not a legitimate one. But one never knows what's going on in the life of another. And sometimes actually that person needs to let off steam on Shabbat, and having a guest there doesn't help them do that. And if they were to be there, it wouldn't necessarily be such a great experience. So we shouldn't always presume that those who seem to be able to host are necessarily able to host. They may well be unable whatsoever, and they just need time for themselves, which may well be itself difficult, and perhaps they need to be hosted by others for their burdens to be lifted and for them to be told that somebody else cares.
I agree. We have a few questions. I'll open it up to general questions, but I'd like to hit the two that were already asked that we didn't get to yet. The first one was, is it inappropriate for a wife to give out benchers after a 3-hour meal? I personally don't think so, but what do you say, Rabbi Johnny?
I'm sorry, I didn't say who's asked this question. I don't understand why it might all be inappropriate.
Well, it was a sub question to my husband feels bad about giving out benchers because he thinks it makes them leave, but I disagree. And then she asked, is it inappropriate for the wife to give out benchers?
Not at all. It's your home.
I don't think so.
You get to be the pacemakers of your meal. That's absolutely your right. In fact, I'd argue it's even your duty. Somebody needs to be kind of weirdly the grown up in the room. Somebody needs to say the meal is starting, the meal is ending. It's not rude to end a meal. It's called being practical. A meal has to end. A person needs to recite grace after meals. This is how one does it. It is a useful code, which a lot of people perhaps should pay attention to. I don't think so. But if somebody does a gesture which suggests that it's time to move on, then all the better. There are, again, these code languages, and giving out grace after meals booklets is probably one of them. Certainly.
But I do think it's important to have a conversation with your spouse or your partner and be like, at the 3-hour mark, this is what I'm doing. Like, let the other person know, so it's not like you're having a disagreement at the table, because I feel like you need to be on the same page about it. So it seems like the problem isn't necessarily giving out the benchers. It's more about what the two of you think is acceptable behavior as a host.
Well, I'll throw one more thing. I know your time is running away. The problem, though, is my wife is an extrovert and I'm an introvert. So I wanted to finish after like 15 minutes, and she was happy to continue for 4 hours. So it works when it doesn't work. Right. So correct. There needs to be some measure of compromise, and especially when you're not a married couple, but may have a group of friends, and different people have different needs, etc. So yeah, I think one needs to say this is what we do, but different people also have different needs. And people being able to step away from a meal and others continuing after it's formally been finished is also a legitimate thing to do. That's not a terrible thing. It's just understanding that that person needs to be doing something else, and this person is happy to continue schmoozing.
Okay, so this is kind of a big question, but I definitely want to bring it up, and we can just try to keep the answer as short as possible. I know it's probably like its own lecture on its own, but I'd love to know more about how to deal with taboo topics. I would never raise these topics like politics or religion as a guest, but if they're raised, I sort of have a rule not to disagree with my host and not to disagree with my host by disagreeing too strongly with any guest. This has meant that I have let comments slide, which I find pretty horrible, which is fine, or which I let comments directed at me slide, which I don't love. I behave differently when I'm with friends, not for a meal, but just to hang out, where I have no problem arguing. So, how much of yourself, when you're a guest, can you let slide just to keep the peace at the table? Or should you not let slide?
It's such an interesting question, because both from the work I do as a spiritual coach and just through the kind of experiences I have as a teacher, these issues do arise. In fact, I'm reading a book right now by Daniel Shapiro titled Negotiating the Non-Negotiable, with a chapter titled Taboos, meaning how do you deal with conflict resolution when it's pivoted around a taboo? And he begins by basically saying you need to understand why things are taboo. I'd say there are certain things which actually aren't taboo. They're just disagreeable. It's okay to say, I don't see things that way. Still, when a host raises a question, sometimes they're really not interested in discussion. They're interested in giving a lecture. It's a rhetorical question. When they say, what do you think of the current government? They're really not interested in you saying, I love them, right? They're interested in you saying, oh, I agree with whatever you're about to say in code, right? So you have to read the room and say, what are they really asking me? Are they actually asking my opinion? Or is this one of those kind of teacher questions when they know the answer and they're already going to decide how they want the conversation to play out? Knowing who's speaking and why they're asking is far more important than necessarily your opinion. Because once you know what is a taboo, and once you know what is this person even trying to achieve by raising that topic, then you can pivot and say, I haven't really thought it through, or you can give a really, really detailed opinion, and that will impress and inspire the person who's raising that question. But you need to know a little bit more to be able to know how to, decide your next move.
So if someone says something that's disagreeable to you, not necessarily the host, but another participant at the meal, do you just let it slide? So I'm kind of the opinion like, okay, well, we'll just agree to disagree because I think you're nuts, but
I have a general rule of thumb, which is I don't have to say everything that I think. If somebody specifically says, Johnny, what do you think of what, Shirley said about this, then I have a duty to respond, or at least a common courtesy to offer some opinion. But if somebody says something, I don't need to respond. And sometimes I choose not to, because it takes a certain energy out of me, and I'm probably not going to formulate my thoughts, especially if it's, let's say, on a Friday night and it's late and I'm tired, and I really can't be bothered to go into a half an hour debate about something which to my mind is fairly clear cut. It's not being dismissive. It's simply saying, I'd rather us having a lovely time here and not go into that. If you can communicate that non-verbally, even better. But one isn't bound to speak certain things. One is bound to be courteous when one speaks. So I generally, if I find some idea disagreeable, I generally won't say anything unless I find it to be so problematic that I'd say it's unethical not to set the record straight.
Okay, good to know. Okay, we have one last question for tonight, and then we'll say goodnight. Should we avoid having guests who don't speak the same language and are from very different backgrounds, which makes the conversation difficult? This question for me it comes up a lot because I feel like being an immigrant, And my Hebrew is okay, but my husband's Hebrew is okay. And and sometimes we want to connect more with the families in the community, but we don't necessarily feel so comfortable. And I think that the reverse is also true, that they don't necessarily feel so comfortable having us, because they know that our Hebrew is not great and their English isn't great. And it's hard, but nevertheless I find that like we often are able to find some common ground, and it's okay. And I don't feel like the need to have conversation is so important, or like that you can get by with something very, very basic, and that it's okay. What do you think?
I think that doing things together brings people together, and breaking bread together, sharing a joke, singing a song can build tremendous bridges, even if there are certain words that aren't fully understood. I'll tell you one super quick story. It's just a great story, actually, of being a guest and a host. It's a story told by the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. He says there was a time when it was looking likely that Jordan and Israel might well be able to broker a peace deal. And at that time, Lord Mishkon of England invited King Hussein of Jordan and Shimon Peres for a meal. He thought he'd be able to get them together and basically move things forward. And they had a lovely meal. They all actually did speak English in terms of physical language, but they were kind of thinking a different cultural language. So they had their meal, everyone was courteous, and they, shared some jokes, but the result wasn't necessarily reached. And at the end of the meal, basically, King Hussein and Shimon Peres were basically about to leave the apartment and say thank you. And so Lord Mishkon felt that there was more to be done, but didn't quite know what to do. So he said, "What are you doing?" They said, we're courteously leaving. I don't think they said those words. He said, "You can't leave, you have to wash up." And they thought, sorry? What do you mean? One was like the Prime Minister of Israel, and one was a king. He said, "No, in my house, you have to wash up." And both, because they had good manners, said, "Fair enough." And Rabbi Sachs describes how, I can't remember who was doing washing, who was doing the drying, but basically King Hussein stood next to Shimon Peres and for 45 minutes did the washing up and clearing up. And he said, people doing things together bring people together. He said, after that moment, they became really close as individuals, because the distance, which was still felt during the meal, was shattered through participating in some kind of activity. We often think that language is a border, is a wall. And sure, that sometimes impedes certain nuance in expression. But spending time together, eating together, singing together, washing up together can bring people closer. In his mind, it could have brought countries closer. And so we shouldn't undersell time and shared moments, because that's what homes are there for. Shared moments of bringing people together. If it be a family or if it be guests, that's what we're really giving. Moments together to create closeness, to show that we care.
That is a really great story. I love it. And one thing I'll just add to that is that I think that even if your guests even if your hosts don't necessarily want you to participate like in actual labor of cleaning up, I feel like you can still walk into the kitchen and chat with them while they're doing the dishes, or offer to grab a towel and dry. Like, I get a lot of satisfaction out of washing the dishes, but sometimes I need a little help with the drying. I don't have enough room. So like, offer to pick up a towel, or just bring your plate in the kitchen. Like, it makes your host, if they decline, then they decline. But like, at least if they're standing there, you can go into the kitchen and just chat with them. You don't have to just make yourself comfortable on the couch. And like, I feel like that's a really nice way to just connect. And I feel like that's the whole point, is just connection.
And that works in lots of different ways. I was in somebody's house a few weeks ago. They were preparing a meal. I said, "What can I do?" They had a young baby. They said, "Honestly, if you can play with my baby, that will give me the ability to get on with what I need to do." I said, "Are you kidding me? With pleasure. I love babies," right? So I got to play train or Lego, and And the hostess was just thrilled. She was able to have 20 minutes without this child just grabbing on her legs the whole time. It was a win-win. You never quite know what will be useful, but that was very useful. And for me, it was a great pleasure.
I want to thank Rav Johnny tonight for joining us. And yes, that is actually a great resource, Shabbat.com, to help find a guest or to host people for Shabbat. We actually use Shabbat.com all the time, and we really like it. We've had some very interesting guests from there, and some great guests from there, and some, it runs the gamut. Anyway, but definitely do love Shabbat.com. I want to thank Rav Johnny for tonight. In memorial to my mom, my aunt who is on the call tonight posted a picture of my mom in the chat, so you could scroll up to see it. I think she would have enjoyed tonight. And she's here with us in spirit, I hope. And to all of you who came, I appreciate you showing up to help me honor her in this way and honor her memory. And like I said at the beginning, it was really important to her that everybody feel welcome in her house. She was excellent hostess. Oh, thanks, Sarah. My dad says he still has the coffee. And Sarah says she feels like she knows Ruth because she knows me. Anyway, I appreciate each and every one of you who came tonight. And for anybody who's watching this on the replay, I appreciate you too. Let it be in my mother's memory that that you're watching this, and she will, I hope, get all the credit for it. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, and I hope that this helps you all do this mitzvah a little bit better.
טוב, אז קבענו טנטטיבית ליום שישי ונסגור סופית לפני, בסדר?
Somebody is